Tout être humain enraciné ici-bas par une certaine poésie terrestre, reflet de la lumière céleste qui son lien plus ou moins vaguement senti avec sa patrie universelle. Le malheur et le déracinement. Simone Weil, Attente de Dieu, 1942. This is the Transdisziplin Simone Weil Denkkollektiv. For our conference on Simone Weil, Death Text Resonance, Simone Weil and Writing Towards Death, in July 2020, we invited scholars from different fields to choose a text by Simone Weil or a somehow related writer or thinker to read and discuss. This time we are going to hear Kathryn Lawson on Decreation as Destruction or as Creation. Currently, Kate is working as a PhD candidate in the Department of Philosophy at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, Canada. The following abstract of her talk might help you to navigate through Kate's approach and to easily get an overview of the various topics that might be discussed during our conference. The ethical implications of Simone Weil's Decreation are perhaps the most controversial of her work, and it is difficult to determine if she is asserting a violent destruction of the human body or a creation of the human spirit as linked with God. Rowan Williams claims that Weil's Decreation requires the I to dissolve completely and thus collapses the side of ethics. But Yoon Sook Cha argues that the ethical side opened in Weil is not the I, but the in-between. I will suggest that decreation holds both destruction, death, and creation, life, open in order to enter a radical shift in perspective from dualistic to relational through the creation of a bridge between the I and God.
Hello, bonjour, greetings. My name is Kate Lawson, and I'm a PhD candidate from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, studying philosophy. And I'm here to discuss the second half of Rowan Williams' chapter on the necessary non-existence of God in Simone Weil. Rather than offering a close reading of Williams or a robust thesis of my own, my hope in this brief talk is to pull on a few ideas from different sources and to incite conversation around some of the ethically problematic issues of Weil's thought. My main point of focus is the ethically problematic structure of Weil's thought and the awkward tension in her work between the natural and the supernatural. What interests me in this vein is the concept of decreation. Is decreation a creative spiritual force that allows us to shed the ego, making way for the existence of alterity in an ethics of social justice? Or is it a violent annihilation of the self, both spiritually and perhaps physically through suicide, and as such the destruction of the only viable site of ethics? I believe that Williams is right that Weil scholars must grapple with this morally problematic tension in Weil if we are to do her thought justice. There are absolutely times, indeed full essays and collections of her work, where Weil's work yields a disavowal of any form of violent bodily self-annihilation and promotes a fierce spiritual purification of the I to allow for the ethical existence of alterity and the actions of social justice. This occurs in the name of loving the world, the neighbor, and ultimately God. But so too do Weil's New York and London notebooks, her final recorded writings, promote an increased privation of the body and a yearning for death as the moment of obtaining pure, divine, loving consciousness. The simple answer to the question, is decreation creative or destructive, is yes. At times it is creative, at times destructive, and at times it is both, or it is beyond the binary of the two. In my opinion, the tension in Weil's thought, which manifests in every one of her concepts, love, necessity, will, decreation, time, God, etc., all comes down to the ontological structure of her cosmology and the hermeneutics of her reading, aka the decreation of God, and the decreation of the individual, the ontological determination, and the epistemic return. Wei's unique interpretation of Plato and her use of bridges, or the emphasis on the relational, is a major contributor to this awkward tension, but it may also serve to overcome it. In my reading, the ontological structure of Wei's thought can be considered in three realms: the natural, the material, earthly, physical, force, gravity; the supernatural, the conceptual, spiritual, divine, grace; and three, the beyond, both the natural and the supernatural at once, but also neither, in a state beyond the two. More than the duality of natural and supernatural, the liminal third space and the continual movement between the three are, I believe, the realm of Wei's ontological structure that brings about the problematic confusion. Until death, decreation has no end, but is a continual negotiation between same and alterity, natural and supernatural, I and other, willing, consenting, self, and God. With this understanding of her structure, do we agree with Williams that Wei's concepts risk collapse under the weight of her contradictions? Can she maintain a dynamic fluidity between the natural, the supernatural, and the beyond between? We must particularly note that at times these distinctions seem to become muddled within Wei's own thought, and the laws of the natural apply to the supernatural and vice versa. In his book No Passion Spent, George Steiner notes that Wei's article, quote, presses closely the logical weakness, the tendencies toward argumentative fiat in Wei's position. Williams points to the enormous problems Weil has with the actual possibilities of self-love or love of the particular, end quote. Steiner points to the problematic way that Weil scholars have a tendency to sweep under the rug, along with Weil's simultaneous anti-Semitism and the similarity of her decreation to Kabbalistic Zimzum. Well, we have to bracket the anti-Semitic sentiment in her later notebooks in this talk. I do think it is a pivotal conversation for Weil scholars. I suggest, rather than shying away from either her self-destruction or her self-creation, we look to see how she keeps both open and how she perhaps fails in her own writing and life to strike the just balance towards which she so adamantly strives. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to look at Errico Springstead's suggestions around Weil's Methexis and Yoon Sook Cha's site of ethics as the in-between in Weil. I don't think that either of these are going to solve the problem of Weil's dialectic, but I do think that they will help us to imagine ways in which we can support the ontological structure of Weil's thought, so adamantly attempting to find balance, and read the moments of potential collapse as her own moments of losing equilibrium within this dance. As Weil says in her lectures on philosophy, quote, the very nature of the relationship between ourselves and what is external to us, a relationship which consists in a reaction, a reflex, is our perception of the external world. Perception of nature, pure and simple, is a sort of dance. It is this dance that makes perception possible for us. End quote. The relationship between internal and external action and thought changes across Weil's oeuvre and is well summarized by Peter Winch in his introduction to Weil's lectures on philosophy. But the metaphor of a dance is well suited to the balance that Weil sometimes strikes and sometimes fumbles through. In his Christus Mediator, Platonic mediation in the thought of Simone Weil, Springstead makes sense of this by the use of Methexis in Weil as the bridge between the quotidian and the divine that Weil unpacks in her essay, The Pythagorean Doctrine. Springstead describes these bridges as, quote, things, states or activities within this world, which are subject to the correlates of good and evil. They are things which can be limited, can in a limited way be used to bring the soul into contact with God. End quote. Bridges constitute the third space that is between and beyond. And Springstead makes it clear that Methexis has been often overlooked because of scholars' often justified hesitance to reify certain objects as examples. These are not objectively Methexis, but become so in a combination of their own purity as harbingers of the good and my attention to said object. A secular poem may act as a bridge, bringing me closer to the good if I devote enough attention to that poem. On one hand, the purity and decreation, or lack of I, in the Lord's Prayer gives it an extraordinary potential to act as a bridge. But on the other hand, if my own attention does not meet the prayer, it will never become a bridge to me. On the other hand, if my attention is engrossed in, for example, George Herbert's poem, Love 3, then this poem may act as a bridge. In his book, A Just Balance, Peter Winch notes that Springstead pushes Methexis beyond mere metaphor. In this way, the third space I have suggested becomes literal and is neither natural nor supernatural, but the interplay between the two. We can consider it as the Holy Ghost to the natural God the Son and the supernatural God the Father. Understanding Methexis as a pivotal relational term seems to me to be how we will keep Weil's thought from the danger of collapse that Williams suggests. This leads us to Yoon Sook Cha's ethical treatment of Weil in her book Decreation and the Ethical Bind, Simone Weil and the Claim of the Other, which notes the problematic nature of Weil's claim, quote, and this is a quote from Weil, "Here is born the notion of a destiny under which executioners and their victims are similarly innocent. Conquerors and conquered are brothers in the same misery." End quote. Cha notes that we are reticent to agree to such a claim. Well, the implications for something like intergenerational trauma and the cycle of the nature of violence can be understood in Weil's breathtaking claim. It also dangerously and perhaps unjustly removes culpability from the oppressor. Cha notes, quote, "I would submit that it is precisely here, in this position of radically uneven power, born of one's exposure to force, that the key to resisting the notion of commanding power everywhere might be found in a relationship to the other that does not seek to harm him might emerge." End quote. The shared force between oppressor and oppressed contains within it the potential of grace and recognition. Weil claims that it is only through my suffering that I am able to appreciate the suffering of the other. In this sense, my own suffering or affliction, my reduction to mere objectivity by those who wield force phenomenologically, opens my ethical duties. We recognize the wisdom of Zosima in the brothers Karamazov, who claims each of us is guilty before everyone, for everyone, and I more than the others. Our responsibility here is to halt the cycle of violence through the miraculous defiance of force. It is a miracle to have force on one side and not use it against the other. In this way, Weil agrees with Ivan Karamazov's position that the world is evil, but she disagrees that as long as one child suffers, we can have no God. Only through Ivan's decreation, or anyone's for that matter, could God have access to ending the suffering of the innocent. And for all of their philosophical flourishes, the brothers Karamazov is filled with characters so driven by ego and willing that such moments are rare. The key claim that I would like to note here is that the site of ethics that Cha sees in Weil is neither the oppressor nor the oppressed, but the in-between, the birth of a new relationality. It is the ethical space opened by the possibility of Methexis, the metaphor that becomes literal both ethically and ontologically. This space is accessed through a decreation which does away with the will of the I, but not the body of the I. As Richard Rees notes in the introduction to Weil's first and last notebooks, quote, "She believed suffering should be avoided when legitimately possible, but she knew it was often unavoidable, and she knew its potential value." End quote. Of course, the productivity and spiritual ethical use of self-annihilation and suffering cannot be denied or brushed past in Weil. But with this in mind, I will offer a quote from Lisa McCullough's The Religious Philosophy of Simone Weil. Quote, "Suicide is an act of the will, whereas decreation, in diametric contrast, is an act of supernatural love responding to grace. Suicide is condemned as an ersatz form of decreation. We cannot affect this death of the Pauline old man ourselves. We have got to be killed as an effect of grace, not will. We must die, not commit suicide, die. Be killed, not literally, but nearly so. Feel through the fact of external things the chill of death. Suffering and affliction communicate this chill of death, which if it were not pressed upon us by necessity, we would actually face or undergo." As promised, I don't think we have solved Williams' awkward duality or Weil's thought, but I do think that my suggestions of Weil's Trinitarian structure and her Christian Platonic ontological determination and epistemic return, Springstead's explication of Methexis, Cha's relational side of ethics, and McCullough's distinction between suicide and decreation will give us a jumping off point for this conversation. I so look forward to hearing what everyone thinks. Thank you so much.
More information on our network, the Transdisziplin Denkkollektiv, as well as on the conference, you'll find at www.simonweil-denkkollektiv.de. Feel free to contact us and to join the discussion.